three-part series when I'm going to be looking at the French attitude to mistresses, I suppose. I'd like to start with François Hollande. On a rather cold morning in January, there was a journalist stationed early outside the Élysée Palace, when he saw a rather tubby little character emerging from the Élysée Palace and jumped on the back of a scooter, which obviously had someone who was probably a security man on the front. The journalist went back the next day and found that the same scenario turned out, and he followed them and found that these two people on the scooter were going to a little apartment somewhere near the Bastille. And in fact, this scenario played out something like 3 mornings in a row. And eventually, of course, it would erupt into this enormous scandal with François. It turned out that François Hollande was cheating on his official mistress with another mistress. And this, of course, was quite interesting in the French context, because usually the French treat this with a sort of a Gallic shrug, you know, as we know on the films that we see in the television series. They move seamlessly from one bed to another with the shrug, a cigarette, and everything's fine. This, of course, isn't exactly the way it happens, but the French, on the whole, don't find this idea of infidelity to be really something that one should make a fuss about. In fact, for them there is a strict barrier between the private life and the public life, particularly of figures in the government. However, this Monsieur François Hollande going off with another mistress was spread across all of the newspapers in Europe. However, in the French press, it was relegated to page 3 after some cheese shop burglary in the Marais. And the same thing on the news. It was sort of about number 5 of interest. And this was, of course, quite typical of the French with their presidents. François Mitterrand, for example, had a parallel family when he was actually in the Élysée. And people only knew about this family, who lived actually in the Élysée Palace with his wife and family on one side and the mistress and the family on the other. No one in the press breathed a word of it until the funeral, where you actually had the illegitimate child and the legitimate children lined up in front of the coffin, and the wife and the mistress standing behind, chatting. That this was considered quite normal. And I'm mentioning this because very recently, in fact in the last couple of weeks, this mistress, who's now in her 70s, has allowed the love letters of François Mitterrand to her to be published. So that, of course, will be of great interest. So this had been happening with presidents for a long time. The only problem now with the French was, first of all, they didn't want to be seen to be looking like the Americans, as they found to their detriment. I'll just talk about this in a moment, with someone else, which is Dominique Strauss-Kahn, right, who of course was the president of, or head of, the International Monetary Foundation, and who was going to be the socialist candidate for the elections against that Hollande eventually took over. Right. He was, of course, as you know, found having assaulted one of the maids in a hotel. The French, again, were absolutely outraged by this. You know, what is wrong with the American press? And they cheered his wife, Anne Sinclair, who stood by him, smiled, looked fantastic all the way through a grueling trial. However, what has now happened with François Hollande is slightly different, mainly because it affects the highest level of politics, and also it affects the taxpayer. What François Hollande has done is actually install his official mistress as First Lady in the Élysée Palace, giving her her own suite, her own bodyguards, her own secretaries, and so on, and then also having bodyguards for the mistress. So this, in other words, is now affecting the way in which people pay taxes, and the French for the first time have been stirred out of the Gallic shrug syndrome. And to understand why it is concerning on some levels is that we need to actually look at, there are 3 women actually involved in this particular, not exactly triangle, I suppose you'd call it a square, wouldn't you? On the first side we have Ségolène Royal, who was his long-time companion. He, of course, being a socialist, doesn't believe in marriage. I mean, they've been together for something like 30 years. She is the mother of his 4 children, and she was elected as the socialist candidate to run for president against Nicolas Sarkozy. And she ran a very, very convincing campaign and was beaten, but not extraordinarily, well. One of the problems also, of course, that she was a woman. Right? As soon as she was beaten, she announced her separation from François Hollande, and François Hollande then moved in officially with his mistress, who had been in the background anyhow. Now, this woman here, Valérie Trierweiler, more like Rottweiler, shall we say, had been in the background all of the time, and she actually had been a journalist with Paris Match, and had sort of had the first photographs of Ségolène Royal and François Hollande's children. Now, they were a real power couple, these two, Hollande and Ségolène. So she then moves in. Unfortunately, she just can't just accept gracefully the title of First Lady. She's constantly, not exactly jealous, but trying to put down her former rival. And so, for example, when the French next lot of French elections come up, she tweets constantly encouragement to the rival of Ségolène Royal in the constituency where she was running. Which, this of course, once you start tweeting now with all of this electronic media, of course it's a completely different ballgame. So this was outrage. The children would no longer speak to her, and her situation was not good. What happens then, of course, once the news is broken of the trysts between Hollande and Julie Gaillet, an actress half his age, a little bit older than his children, she had actually no idea about this at all, and disappeared into hospital with depression, but managed to emerge, drag herself off her deathbed enough to write a tell-all memoir, Thanks for the Memories, in which Hollande comes out as a cold, rather nasty little character who actually despises the poor and the people who he's supposed to be standing for as a socialist. So now, poor old Hollande is caught basically between these 3 women. As soon as he managed to dismiss Trierweiler, he immediately reappointed his first, so to speak, wife as minister. I don't think she's Minister of Defence, but as a high-ranking minister. Julie Gaillet had started off her career as an offsider to Ségolène Royal in her first political campaign. So there's a kind of slight coalition between the former wife and the latest mistress against the official mistress. All right? So I thought this was extremely interesting, and I wanted to investigate the parallels that this actually had with French history. Has anything really changed? Because basically the French president, of course, occupies the role that the king would have occupied from about the Renaissance times onward. So in this particular lecture, I want to look at unusual relationships, right? Firstly with Diane de Poitiers and Henri II, and later on Louis XIV with 2 of his mistresses, and the sort of what happens between the maîtresse en titre and how she is ultimately undone by a woman who really resembles Louis XIV's mother. So these women that we have been looking at so far are powerful women. A woman who was almost the first French female president of France. You have a very important, well-known journalist, and you have a rising film star who, by the way, his career has taken off since all of this has occurred. And I thought, well, this is quite different. These are women in their own right. However, once you look back at these mistresses who assumed the title of maîtresse en titre, you know, official mistress, you realise that they were extraordinarily able women who quite probably would have been head of BHP or something had they been able to do anything except pursue careers either in a convent or through sort of amatory connections. Now, the first one I want to look at then is Diane de Poitiers, who was 20 years older than the king, who will remain in a relationship with her from the time he was about 18 up until his death, and that was about 25 years of a relationship. And when he dies, she's 60. So in a time when only theoretically youth and beauty was what counted, this must have been an extraordinary woman to be able to hold on to a very important and much younger man. Here we have an unusual painting of her, seen in a bath, which at the time was rather sort of revolutionary. She was very interested in hygiene, which is also quite unusual, but she was originally, at least eventually, appointed as governess of the royal children, which you'll see again. The children of these marriages come in as important pawns in many of the situations. Now, I want to look at Henri II as a child. Now, his father was involved, Francis of France, was involved in wars with the Spanish, lost at the Battle of Pavia, and as often happened at the time, instead of becoming a prisoner and a hostage himself, he would send members of his family. So he sent his two young children, who were Henri, who was only 7 at the time, and his elder brother, who was the Dauphin, who would become king. And they were sent off and imprisoned at the French court for 4 years. Now, this is a very, very long time in the childhood of these young people. So the two young princes then were imprisoned at the court. The little boy, Henri, who's not expected to become king, it will be very much affected by this. Now, his mother had already died, 2 years before he left, so he had no female sort of interest. And before he left, a woman from the French court, who was Diane de Poitiers, who was 20 years older than him, steps forward and embraces the young boy and gives him a kiss before he goes into exile. And this basically obviously had a profound effect upon him. Now, while he is actually in the French, imprisoned in Spain, he spends a lot of his time absorbing troubadour literature. Now, the literature that we know of the troubadour, this is about chivalry, about chivalric love, courtly love, where this idea of the knight dedicates himself to an unattainable female figure, and will do everything to serve her. There's no sort of erotic element in it. It's a sort of sublimation of all of these sorts of desires. And he becomes her servant and will carry her colours into battle, and so on. At the time, this sort of literature flourished around Toulouse, but of course Spain and France, as we know it, aren't sort of cut off as the kind of in French hexagon and the sort of hexagon of Spain. There's a whole counties which with different kings and lords which go across all of this area. In fact, the King of Castile, for example, wrote troubadour poetry himself. All right, so this young boy absorbs all of this chivalric type of writing, and is going to, in many ways, throughout his life, is actually going to carry this out in his relationship with Diane de Poitiers. So, before I speak about her, we need to sort of realise that he comes back after 4 years, and as an 11-year-old has to actually take part in a tournament which is held for his father's second marriage. And as a young knight, he is supposed to actually dip his lance in front of the prospective queen or the king's mistress. And he does neither, and a kind of reedy little voice goes along and takes the colours of Diane de Poitiers. Now this, of course, basically causes a scandal. The Maîtresse, the King's Mistress, who's actually there at the coronation and wedding of his queen sitting next to him, also gets very, very upset and disappears. Now, he who was Anne de Poitiers, she was someone who was born into the aristocracy, but one of the lower forms of aristocracy. In France there were two up until the 19th century. There was the noblesse d'épée and the noblesse of the sword. These were people who had won this by valorous deeds, probably many, many sort of generations ago. And the noblesse de robe, who had been actually appointed for services to the king. It could be financial services or something like that. So she belongs to this sort of lower level. She is married off at the age of 15 to a man who's 39 years older than her. Now at that stage, of course, it would be like marrying your grandfather, but this was sort of normal. I mean, we sort of see it as bizarre, but it was, marriages weren't for love. They were all strategic, and either for, economic reasons or for, as I said, strategic ideas with alliances between powers. She was an extremely beautiful woman, extremely elegant. She had been brought up at the French court and had actually been the lady-in-waiting to Henry II's mother, Claude, before she died. And she had an unusual education for a woman at the time. She spoke several languages. She could write Latin and Greek. She had studied mathematics. She was someone who was quite, as you'll see, an author in her own right, and someone who was very, very savvy as well. When her husband finally dies, she becomes the seneschal herself and runs the family properties, and all of the realm very, very succinctly. Now,
she has children?
Yes, she has two children by her first marriage. We'll talk about her looks in a moment. So here we have this young man who actually will not start an affair with her until he's 17 or 18, right? He's sort of a rather melancholy character, and I think what's interesting with these very early portraits, that even though they're always painted to please the person, the sitter, you can see that there is a certain reserve or melancholy about him, obviously from these years as a child, basically orphaned and then brought up in foreign courts. Now, to make matters worse, a royal alliance is set up. Now, he is not at the moment the heir to the throne, right? His brother is the heir. So they decide that they're going to marry him off to one of the Medicis. Now, this is to consolidate an alliance with the Tuscan area. It wasn't an illustrious marriage, right? And in fact, there's a lot of dispute about whether they should even ally themselves with these Medicis as it was, because the Renaissance court of Florence, which is hard to believe, was considered as rustic and unsophisticated in comparison to the French court. But the French tend to think that anyway. However, Catherine de Medici was not an ideal beauty, right? We saw what... Well, we'll look in a moment at the ideal of beauty at the time. It was tall, willowy, fair-headed, blue-eyed, and so on. And you get poor little Catherine de Medici, who is short, who is dumpy, who has no sort of wit at all, and is considered rather unsophisticated in comparison to the others. She doesn't speak French very well, whereas most of the people at the French court were quite fluent in other languages. So unfortunately she falls in love with her little husband, which is not the sort of thing that one did. This was actually a royal alliance, and she could expect, to actually for him to have mistresses. Well, they're married off at the age of 14, and as happened at the time, they had to consummate the marriage in public. Everything was done in public, can you imagine? And this was very important because these marriages were simply to consolidate regional ties, power ties, and they needed children from these marriages to make sure that there was a continuation. So therefore, if there were no children, the royal family, the French royal family, were within their rights to send her back. And basically half the dowry hadn't been paid anyhow, and keep the part that had been paid, but send her back and then get a new one, so as to speak, who actually is more useful. So for about 10 years, they're not going to have any children, and so this is going to be a great sticking point, and in fact it is going to be Diane de Poitiers who is going to step in and make sure that things happen in a better way. Now, Diane, as I said, was exactly the opposite physically. She was exactly the ideal beauty. She was tall, very slender, had sort of alabaster skin, reddish, would have been a strawberry blonde, elegant, sophisticated, educated, and knowing. So the king, by the age of 18, as I said, after coming back from a war, having already fathered a couple of children, comes back and finally they become lovers. And of course, for him, it's his first real sort of affair with a sophisticated woman, and for her, it's the first time she's actually had a passionate affair with a young man, as opposed to the fourth man who was nearly 40 years older. And this sort of passion between them is going to last for quite a long time, even though she's 20 years older. But she would have been at the height of her beauty when he's about 18. She would have been about 38. Now, the queen, she, as I said, she was extremely educated, and they would write together as well. And this is actually, there was a book of poems that Diane de Poitiers has written. These are these very complex ballads, at least sonnets, which are written in Old French. Very flat. The language is extremely flowery, and I'll come back to that when we're actually talking about the other mistresses later on. And this is again a sort of a fantasy of Cupid coming and putting flowers on her heart, and of course it's this beautiful young man. And of course she has by now taken on the persona of Diana the Huntress, right? So she is always seen as this alter ego. Now, that is her symbol, of course, the crescent moon. Diana was the goddess of the hunt and the goddess of the moon, and also she was supposed to be a virgin as well, but I don't think that was sort of part of the image here. Now, Catherine de Medici by now still has no children and is extremely jealous of the role that Diane is playing at court. The king clearly cannot have enough of her. He spends most of his day, when he's not actually legislating or out at war or in tournaments, he spends in the apartments of Diane. And so Catherine, who actually has the apartments above her, actually has holes in the floor drilled so she can actually see what's going on, and she's terribly dismayed to sort of see the sort of passionate embraces of these two people. However, there is a talk that maybe they'll have to get rid of Catherine. She has no children, and Diane de Poitiers then enters the story because it's not in her interest for him to marry someone who's a ravishing beauty, who is sexually attractive, and who could theoretically become a rival to her. And so she basically goes down and speaks to the Queen and tells her, that you need to do a few different positions and all the rest of it. I won't go into it, but seriously, it's documented that she actually sort of coaches the two of them, because there was a little irregularity, which I won't go into because we've got gentlemen in the audience. And eventually they will have 10 children, all right? So it was a very, very useful lesson. She, of course, has no children herself, which is quite interesting, which, of course, will make her slightly vulnerable as well. The king is delighted now. He's not actually king at this point, but he is delighted, and he will eventually make Diane the governess of the royal children. So Catherine de Medici is now in a situation where her husband spends all his time with Diane, and her children are brought up and are schooled and looked after also by Diane. And Catherine de Medici develops this wonderful motto, odiate e aspettate, hate and wait. And she will get her chance. In the meantime, the two lovers work as a pair, and Diane has extraordinary influence on the running of the affairs of state. Her symbol, D, as you can see here, is combined on both ways so that it looks like an H. All right? So in other words, there's total consolidation of the two of them. And this symbol appears absolutely everywhere. On the ceilings of the Louvre, which is the royal palace, in some of the other palaces, as soon as you can actually see that if you look up, here is the D and the H. This is the symbol of the royal family. Here's the H and the crescent moon. Crescent moon, of course, being the symbol of Diane. And in case you actually haven't got it, again, there's more of her symbols here. So basically, she is covering the walls. Also, if you go to the Louvre nowadays and you go up the main Renaissance staircase, which is the Henry II staircase, of course it has references to the hunt, of course a symbolic reference to Diane, and H's here, and these crescent moons all over the place, and fertility crafts, and here of course is Diane the huntress. So she actually already owned the Chateau d'Athénais because she was the seneschal after the death of her husband. Once her husband died, she adopted white and black as mourning colours and kept it for the rest of her life. And it's because it set off her beauty with this very, very pale skin, the sort of red hair, blue eyes, and the black and the white. And so all of his life, right until his death, whenever he is in a tournament, he carries the colours of black and white, which are the colours of his mistress. It must have been quite galling to have been the queen, quite frankly. So his brother dies and he becomes the king of France. Catherine, by this time, is pregnant, can't attend, or he doesn't want her to attend. She's sort of shuffled into the back pews, more or less, and Diane stands resplendent, not in a crown, but with a beautiful diadem like the moon with diamonds. He also gives her the crown jewels if she wants to wear them, but she's too discreet, so she actually has all the crown jewels, and he piles upon her castles, and this is actually at Dauphin, which he has done over to have the emblem of Diana the Huntress here. And here we have it again. He commissions paintings to be done of her. Here she is seen as the goddess of the hunt, and there is the chateau that she owns behind. And he elevates her to being a duchess as well, which is very important because only duchesses were supposed to actually belong to the royal family. You could be other types of, you could be a countess or something, but duchesses were supposed to have royal blood. Again, the greatest sculptors of the time, Goujon is commissioned. This is now actually a copy of the real one is in the Louvre. Again, a sculpture of this very slender character. He also constructs for her the Chateau de Chenonceau. Now, a lot of you would know that, wouldn't you? Which is a jewel of a castle with all of the extraordinary work of it being reflected. You can see the castle twice because of the water. Catherine de Medici again coveted this castle and was furious. More paintings dedicated to her, and tapestries as well. And at the end he will give her also the Chateau de Chaumont. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about the end of Henry II, which has extraordinarily dire consequences for the history of France and wars of religion. But before we do that, we have this painting of Diane, who probably, it's an anonymous portrait and there's no date on it, but she would have to have been probably in her 50s at this time. Now, as you can see, gravity hasn't taken any toll. All right, but you know, the French are sort of very small-breasted. However, the thing that she's trying to exhibit here, because she's seen as a goddess, you know, it's okay to paint her like that because she's sort of, this is supposed to be, it is her obviously, but she's seen as Diane the goddess. Is this extraordinary sort of complexion, the white alabaster skin. And recently, I'll just see if I've got no, I haven't got the tomb of Diane has been discovered. And we'll look at the tomb in a moment. It was desecrated at the time of the Revolution, and her bones were actually placed somewhere else. And people have now dug up around the Chateau d'Athénès, and they found what is unquestionably her bones, because she actually had broken her leg, and this clearly is a break. And they've found incredibly high proportions of gold and mercury in the bones, and they've also, the body still had some hair left, it had been slightly mummified, and they've found that basically she must have been ingurgitating gold, an elixir of gold, to try and preserve her beauty, because this is, at the early Renaissance, this idea of alchemy, gold as being something which will is an eternal metal, and therefore you will become eternally beautiful. To be able to ingurgitate gold, it has to be mixed with mercury, and the mercury will give you anemia, and this is probably why she had this extraordinarily pale countenance. She had very thinning hair as well. But even so, she's going to die when she's about 65 or 66, which is still for someone at that time a very ripe old age. So this is a sort of vanity, it wasn't, there were stories about the fact that she used to bathe in gold, she drank gold, and everyone sort of thought, oh, it's ridiculous. Well, it's not. Well, because she's getting older, Henry's eyes do stray, and what happens is that at the time, the sister of the Queen the brother of the Queen was one of the Geese and had been married over in Scotland, and their child was Mary Queen of Scots. And the hope was that they would marry off Mary Queen of Scots, who was going to become Queen of Scotland, to the Dauphin of France, and therefore you'll get a union of the French and the Scottish crown, with the ascendancy of the Geese family, the ultra-Catholic family, who are going to pop up in a moment. And so Mary Queen of Scots comes over as a princess had to do. Once she had betrothed, they had to then be brought up in the French court so that she would lose her rustic Scottish ways and become French. Well, unfortunately, she brings with her Jane Stuart, Lady Fleming, who is supposed to be a raving beauty. I mean, I can't quite see it, but anyway, she also had red hair, pale skin, and obviously this is the type that Henry went for, and he started an affair with her. Well, immediately. Who is alerted of it? Diane. And Diane is actually at the Chateau d'Athénès, nursing a broken leg from hunting, and it is the Queen who lets her know, because the Queen also doesn't want another floozy in on the whole system. So for the moment there's a kind of a coalition between these two women. Diane hotfoots it back to Paris as the King emerges from Lady Fleming's chambers, upbraids him in front of the entire court and says, what do you think you're doing? Do you realise you're jeopardising this union between the French throne and the Scottish throne by having an affair with someone who's as tawdry as a lady in waiting? Anyhow, it has a great effect. Henry drops the whole thing and creeps back to his mistress and to the Queen. So hostilities resume between the Queen and the Maîtresse en titre. Now, things are going quite well until the marriage of the daughter of Catherine de Medici and Henry II. They're making another alliance, this time with the Spanish. And their daughter Elizabeth is to marry the Infanta of Spain. And so there are extraordinary tournaments which are going to be, and festivities in the court in Paris. Now, Catherine de Medici was very superstitious, and as everyone was at the time, and the devil was also someone that was not revered but spoken about as much as Christ. There was the idea of evil was something which was supposed to be constantly present in society. And so to ward this off, one had recourse to soothsayers, fortune tellers, and so on. And Catherine was very impressed by Michel de Notre Dame, who's born in Saint-Rémy de Provence, who was famous for his quatrains. She actually took the whole French court down there to consult him about her future. And this is actually true. He actually came up with, in the quatrain 35, a young lion will overcome the older one on the field of combat in a single battle. He will pierce his eyes through a golden cage, 2 wounds made one, then he dies a cruel death. Catherine is very worried about this because this tournament was coming up for the marriage of her child, and it was going to take place in what is now the Place des Vosges. The Place des Vosges is set up about 20 or 30 years later because it will have been vacated by the royal court. The king and queen lived in the Hôtel des Tournelles in the Marais, more or less the area of the Place des Vosges coming towards Rue de Rivoli. All of that area would have been taken over. And it was there, towards the Rue de Rivoli, that the combat takes place. The king, of course, is there with Queen on one side, Diane on the other side, goes down to fight, or to joust, and it's the end of the day. It's basically the last jousting session, or second last, and Montgomery, who is a member of the Scots Guards, is set against him, and Montgomery almost unseats him, and that was supposed to be the last one. And the king says, no, I want to do it again. He wants to finish in a triumph. And so even though the court say, look, it's getting late, no, he goes down. He's been very hot and bothered and makes the same mistake that Francois Hollande did. He didn't pull down his visor. And he gallops away. Montgomery actually lance, it was a mistake. He wasn't trying to actually aim at the king at all, and his lance enters through the vizier into his eye. There is absolute consternation. The king is taken away and will die a very, very long, excruciating death during 7 days, probably of septicemia. They managed to even for the first time, you actually get the court of Spain and even the court of England are going to send over doctors who just really rely on bleeding and so on. And so he will die. He calls out constantly for Diane de Poitiers, but Catherine de Medici, of course, wait and hate, and her moment has come, right? It has actually been suggested to her by a group of Italians early on, why don't we just get rid of Diane de Poitiers? But, the Queen had decided that wasn't the way to go. But now she has her chance. So she banishes Diane, takes back the crown jewels, takes back the children, appoints another governess, and sends Diane to her estate at Athénès, which is the only one that she now has, and Marie de Medici then builds the Tuileries Palace, all right, and lives there. She can no longer stand living at the Hôtel des Tournelles. She's actually very fond of her philandering husband. Now, it was a disaster for France, because at this time, of course, you have the rise of the Protestant religion, the Huguenots in France in particular, and the ultra-Catholic side of the Geese family. These are the ones who are involved with Mary Queen of Scots. Catherine de Medici now becomes regent to her eldest son, to the first one, who will only reign for a year. He's very young at the time. He's about 11. The second son, Charles IX, will reign for a longer time, but he also is so weak. In fact, this little fellow was so upset at having to be crowned that someone actually had to carry it for him, and he was crying all the way through the coronation. I think he reigns for about 11 years, but he's very young. He's 15 or 16. He's totally under his mother's thumb. And when you finally get Henry III, he will be assassinated by a mad monk after a year, and who is also homosexual. So there is no issue from this male side of the family. The Guise actually are going to take power, and we have a female member of the family who is Margot. Now, have any of you read Dumas' Reine Margot? Right. No, she is married off to her cousin, Henry of Navarre, who is a Protestant.
Oh, yes.
Right? Okay. And all of the Protestants come to Paris for the wedding. And the signal then is given by Catherine de Medici. I mean, it's now looking as though she wasn't quite as fanatical as that, but for the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, all right, where all of the leaders of the Protestant nobles basically are killed. Henry himself survives simply because his wife keeps him and the Prince de Conti in her bedroom, and that people, they just don't feel they can violate the royal bedroom, so that they're saved basically, and he will go out and lead the Protestant forces against the Guises. So now you have the 80-year war, which would have been avoided basically had Henry not died at the age of 40 in a stupid tournament, right? And if Diane de Poitiers quite possibly had been there rather than the Queen now taking over and having a position of power. So this then is a disastrous, and this is a painting which shows how she's probably not implicated to the degree that the painting shows, but she is seen as the major instigator of this sort of pogrom against the Protestants, which weakened the French economy. The Protestants flee up to the lowlands or to England. They are the artisans and they are the middle classes, and the French economy is going to be weakened for a number of centuries. However, Catherine is buried at Saint-Denis alongside Henry II, and this is the tomb of Diane, who dies about 6 years later at Athénès, and this was the one which has just recently been reinstated. So we have the extraordinary situation then of an unlikely woman in power, someone who is much older, but possibly, even though she was his lover, possibly played also a kind of a surrogate mother role for a slightly orphaned child. Well, I want to now look at two more women, two rivals who also have a queen as a rival as well. So this is very similar, I would find, to the Francois Hollande situation. I just want to link these people. Henry IV, who we've just seen, now you just have to concentrate here. We've just seen him. He actually becomes king of France because Henry III had died without any children, and in France there's something called the Salic law, where a female cannot become queen, right? So therefore they have to look, even though there's daughters, they have to look to the relatives. And so even though he's a Protestant at the time, he will become king, and he has that famous saying, Paris is worth a mass. Paris vaut une masse, converts to Catholicism. He will then marry another Medici, who is now Marie de Medici, and their son will be Louis XIII, right? Who is also homosexual, as was Henry III. And this, of course, is a real problem when you've actually got a king who actually has to produce heirs. Henry IV had heirs all over the place. Now, Louis XIII will be married off to another Spanish queen who is called Anne of Austria. This is because the Habsburgs controlled Austria as well as Spain. All right, I hope I'm not confusing you too much. She's actually a very savvy, powerful woman. Now, because of the fact that Louis XIII was gay, for 23 years they had no children. Right, so, and then suddenly she conceives little Louis XIV, and he is known as gift of God, Dieu donné. No one seems to doubt his parentage, but which one we know would be admissible, wouldn't it, after 23 years anyway. So he is born, and to the great delight of Anne of Austria as well. There was always this thing, should we get another queen, is it the king's fault? They began to realise, of course, it was the problem was with the king. So little Louis will actually become king. His father dies when Louis is only 5 years old. Now, Louis XIII didn't trust his wife, and so had written all these clauses into the will where there should be special regents and controls. As soon as she gets into power, she gets the will changed and takes on the power as regent. And she is very close to her son. And this is actually going to be quite important when you see the way in which the sort of series of mistresses play out with him. She spends most of her day when she's not involved in political matters, in the apartments of her son. She teaches him literature, teaches him foreign languages, they play musical instruments together. It was most unusual for a royal mother to really have anything much to do with a child, almost basically other than visiting rights at the time. So this is a very, very strong bond which will last throughout Louis's life. So he already then has this strong affection for older women, women who are not exactly intellectuals, but who are very pious, but very reasonable, I suppose, intelligent women. Now, he has a younger brother. This is a painting of Louis XIV when he would be probably 9, and his little brother would be about 7. Now, this is the Duke who will become the Duke of Orleans. Now, he is gay as well. All right, so it's quite interesting how it actually goes through 3 generations. But he's able to sort of function and produces several heirs. He has to sort of do it with sort of amulets and rosaries on all sorts of different bits and pieces of his anatomy. So he goes clinking into battle. But anyway, he does manage to do it. Now he was actually dressed. His mother, Anne of Austria, used to actually refer to him as the prettiest little girl in the court, and people sort of wondered if this was a reaction to the way he was, or whether she was actually projecting this image onto him. He's dressed here as a girl, but this is what children were dressed as. Little boys were until they were 7. They were dressed exactly in girls' clothes, but without the jewellery and without flowers and without handbags, because little boys couldn't be relied on to sort of get to the toilet in time. All right, and so they didn't want messes. Breeches were quite complex. You had different sorts of buttons and belts, and they just thought, it was better. So at 7, they would be breeched, and this putting on breeches, and this would be a big ceremony as well. The child is becoming a man, and often at that stage he'd be taken away from governesses and sent off to male tutors. All right, so we have him, and at this time, when they're very young, when Anne of Austria is regent, she is very much under the thumb of Cardinal Mazarin, an Italian Mazzarini, and there is a lot of feeling against Anne and the royal family. The French people and other members of the royal family feel that he has too much power, and there is a revolt against the royal family. This is called the Fronde, where Anne of Austria has to take her sons and get out of Paris. Right? This also, eventually, the royal family prevails, but this will always stay in Louis's mind. And this is going to be one of the main reasons why he is going to build Versailles, right? Where he has understood the power of these warring members of the lower members of aristocracy, other members of the royal family. And so he's going to isolate them altogether at Versailles, take them away from their seats of power, their seats of military right as well, and turn their entire time into not scheming against him, but scheming against each other for ridiculously small privileges at the court. For example, to be the first one to actually give the chemise to the king, or to be able to say, can I come to Mali with you, which is one of the playgrounds of the king. These tiny little privileges. Whether you actually never knocked at a door at Versailles, you scratched once if you were very high rank, you scratched twice if you were a lower rank. All of these little minutiae that people would vie with. And so, in effect, he controls all of these people in this way. So already with his iconography, he is going to sort of take on a pagan iconography. Here he returns after the Fronde as Hercules. Now, Louis XIV then grows up. He has the famous libido of his grandfather, Henry IV, and at the age of 17 falls wildly in love with one of the nieces of Mazarin. Mazarin brings all his Italian nieces there who are lively, sparkly, and Louis forms a liaison with Marie Mancini. And you can actually see, she jumps out and shoots from a portrait, doesn't she? She's really bright, sparky, interesting, and he loved these intelligent, witty women. Mazarin himself puts the stopper on it because the King of France clearly can't marry someone who is just of the lower aristocracy of Italy. He has to make a great marriage. So she's more or less torn away from him in tears, and he gets instead Maria, the Infanta Maria Teresa of Spain. Every man's, fantasy. Now, she, unfortunately, of course, was a member of the Habsburg dynasty, of course, which was so inbred. But she also had no experience of men at all, and by that I mean the only men she had ever spoken to in her life were her confessor and her father. This sort of came from the Spanish court, where which is almost taking over from the Muslim ancestry of Spain, where the royal women were cloistered, and so she had no brothers, but she wasn't even allowed. So she was utterly amazed. She had to learn to speak to the king. She had to have it written down first and then read it. She was so scared. Of course, she came with a whole retinue of Spanish people, didn't learn to speak French, which of course was a bit of a problem as well. The other problem with her was that she and Louis XIV were actually double first cousins. Right? Louis XIII's sister was her mother, and her father was the brother of Anne of Austria. So you've got this, and they already were the issue of second cousin marriages. And so basically what happens is, I think she eventually has 6 children, but they all either stillborn or die very early. And out of all of this, she only one child survived. Whereas with his mistresses, most of them survive into not middle age, but they don't die as babies. So there she is, Maria Teresa, Queen of France, who really he is not the slightest bit interested in at all. He's been told by his mother he has to do his duty, and he does, but his eyes are elsewhere. But she's very lucky insofar as when she gets to the French court, this is Maria Teresa here, and this is Anne of Austria, because Anne of Austria is not just her mother-in-law, but she's also her aunt. Someone's listening. And this is the Dauphin. Now here we have an interesting sort of family here. Now Louis has already started positioning himself relatively early on in the reign as not just king by divine right, but also as the god Apollo the giver of light. So you've got this pagan image overlaying the Christian image. I'll talk about the divine right of kings in a moment. So here we have a painting of him seated here with his wife. This is Maria Teresa looking a little bit more liberated there, with 3 of her living children and 2 of them who have died. All right, as you know, you often have the dead children as in a painting. This is the only one which will survive into adulthood. So that's his wife. This is his mother, who still plays an enormously important role. There she's clutching the globe because, this is the power of Louis is going to, take over Europe. Here is his brother, who you can see is prancing a little bit there, with his wife, Henrietta, who is the daughter of Charles I of England. And this is her mother, also Queen Henriette, who was in exile at the court of Louis XIV. He was a cousin of Charles. They're all incredibly married. And so these are his daughters. So you can see he actually had 4 daughters. So this is the royal family. Now, the other thing that we need to remember about Anne of Austria is that not only did she have a very strong bond with her son, but she was extremely pious, and at the end of her life retires to a convent. And this, she probably didn't take all of the vows. She might have been a tertiary, which she would have entered and stayed there. And so this idea of sin and this idea of the importance of not committing adultery is always at the back of his mind and comes further and further forward as he gets older. Now, he looks as though he is very interested in his brother's wife. Right? This is his brother's wife over here. the little princess of England. Everyone adored her, called her Reynette. And so the Queen is absolutely outraged. How could Louis be casting eyes on his sister-in-law? So she more or less forbids him to frequent her, and so that they can see each other. There's something quite relatively innocent, one thinks. She sets up a court, and as a decoy employs. This is the person who is set up as the decoy. One of her ladies-in-waiting, Louise LaBelle. All right, this was Henrietta of England. And it works so well that he falls madly in love with her, forgets completely about the princess. And for a while, this woman, who isn't particularly bright, and said, he's not a two planks job, but I mean, she was supposed to be, what is the French called? Bête comme ses pieds, dumb as her feet. But she doesn't look a sparkling intellect here. Here she is dressed up as Diana the Huntress, all right, in deference to the great Diana of Poitiers, all right? And she becomes the maîtresse en titre, to the horror of Anne of Austria. Anyway, so long as it wasn't a relative that he was after. So we have a number of portraits of her. She bears him several children, one of whom will be legitimised. And this is something that's interesting about Louis XIV. Because his own children are going to actually all die off, he legitimises his bastard children. And most of them will marry into the royal family. In fact, one of his daughters by Madame de Maintenon will marry his brother's child. All right? So within one generation, the bastard children are royalty in their own right, and then you have their descendants throughout the kings and queens of Europe. Louise LaBelle is very susceptible to the preaching of the Jesuits at the time, and in the middle of the affair takes fright, in the middle of the night flees to a Carmelite convent. Louis finds out about it, gets on his horse, gallops off, drags her off the floor and takes her back. She has another couple of children, two of which die, but eventually she does retire to a convent, which is what one did when one was being ousted by another mistress. And so she actually becomes a Carmelite nun and is visited by the next maîtresse en titre. God knows what they talked about, but at least I think Carmelites don't speak, so it's probably just as well. In the meantime, with Louise LaBelle pregnant, the Queen pregnant, a lady sees that it is her turn to step up to the mat, so as to speak. And her name is Françoise Athénée de Rochefort de Mortemart, a very, very old family, royal family, who had been noble from about the 12th century onwards, whereas the Bourbons, of course, really were considered upstarts. I mean, this dynasty had started with Henry IV. So we're going to talk about what it was that made her play such a role as maîtresse en titre. But first of all, it's her birth. Louis XIV is constantly reminded by her that basically she's not only his equal, but from the point of view of blood and lineage, vastly superior. And she's one of these capricious, enigmatic, mercurial, tempestuous sort of personalities that absolutely fascinate Louis, but also he sort of feels, that maybe she's right, maybe she is better bred than he. And when she has 7 children by him, and one of the children, as we see, she actually writes to her son, the Duke of Milan, who she won't bring up and who basically aren't interested in her. She says, "You are the son of a hero," i.e. Louis XIV. "It is well that you should know that you are fortunately spared any admixture of blood less noble, as is often the case with people of your kind, and I mean royal bastards. You are the exception to the rule, in that in both bloodlines you can count courage, nobility, and wit. While this gives you a singular advantage to be sure, it still imposes an obligation to live up to both." All right, so in other words, birth and power are important. She was a beautiful woman, as we'll see, but the other thing that she had that fascinated Louis was this idea of esprit. Now, Esprit, I suppose, is something that's hard to translate. In French, it sort of means wit, it means humour, it means intelligence, it means ability to conceptualise, all of these things. But it was something which was really valued in the court of the late 17th and early 18th century. And Françoise had frequented one of these salons, which were set up in the Marais by educated women who wanted to form a kind of a court of intelligence away from what was seen as a sort of rather rustic court, I suppose, of Henry IV, where the men spoke about politics and military and sporting feats, and who sort of belched and spat and all the rest. You can imagine, often sort of, exposed themselves in public. I mean, really were considered actually a bit beyond the pale. And so in these particular salons, women would meet together and talk of high-minded or create conversations where the art of conversation was extremely important. One didn't gather together to talk about oneself. It says le moi est haïssable. It's hateful to talk about oneself. You didn't speak about gossip. You didn't speak about anecdotes. You talk about ideas, and you tried also to refine these ideas to maxims. I don't know if you know the Rochefoucauld's maxim, to try and get ideas down to pithy two-liners. So they had to refine language constantly, and they would discuss mainly matters of the heart, but not, does he like me or not. It was, is it more painful to be in the presence of a man whose heart is given to another than in the presence of a man whose heart is indifferent? Or, there's all these nuances of feeling. And in doing so, Françoise learned this art of conversation, this sort of subtlety, this ability to perform as a speaker and to be able to move, a kind of suppleness in speech. And in fact, these women were called the précieuses because they were seen as precious blue stockings. However, Françoise is going to get away with it because she's beautiful as well. I mean, let's face it, it always boils down to if you're good looking. Yeah. But these précieuses actually take that very flowery French language that you would have seen in the ode of Diane de Poitiers and refine it and refine it and refine it. And it is in many ways due to these salons in the 17th and 18th century, dominated totally by women, that you get the clarity of the French language today. And George Eliot actually sort of says, in France alone, woman has had a vital influence on the development of literature. In France alone has the mind of woman passed like an electric current through language, making crisp and definite what was elsewhere heavy and blurred. In France alone, in the writings of women was swept away if the writings of women were swept away, a serious gap would be made in the national history. So it meant that women could compete now in an area where they were the equal, if not superior to men, which was language and conversation. And Athénée, she takes on this name, this flowery name of Athena, right, and will be known by that. This is another one of these conceits. Now, she was known for her wit. Her whole family had the morte-marque wit, which was frightening. You didn't want to be the butt of it. She used to sort of, in the most sort of languid drawl, say the most, extraordinarily witty, hurtful, biting things. And Saint-Simon, who was the great memoirist, actually wrote about her. He said, she was always the best of company, with graces that palliated her proud and haughty manner, and which were indeed suited to it. It was impossible to have more wit, more refinement, greater facility of expression, eloquence, natural propriety, which gave her, as it were, an individual style of talk, but delicious, and which, by force of habit, was so infectious that her nieces and the persons who were constantly about her all caught the style, which is so recognisable today among the few survivors. So this was a kind of wit, and she was known as Athénée's wit flashed out sharp and sparkling, commanding attention, demanding homage. Though she might pass as the finest woman in the world, there was yet something more agreeable in her wit than in her countenance. All right? So this, of course, was very important. These are the great salonières. You would have heard of Madame de Sévigné, who we know a lot about Madame de Montespan, Madame de Maintenon, through the writings of Madame de Sévigné, who lived at what is now the Countess Castle. Molière, of course, is one of the great court writers at the time, and he writes about these women, but he makes fun of them, the précieuses ridicules. Right? Now, she also had ideal beauty. She had long, blonde, curly hair, which she used to wear in ringlets, and this became, she sort of was outrageous in many ways. Everyone else wore their hair pulled back, but she had this outrageous thing. So after all, the Queen tries to wear her hair like that, and as you can see with Maria Teresa, it just didn't work. But she's actually a fashion setter. She's luscious, lascivious, very, very sensual, and sort of a little pouting mouth and large blue eyes, and this extraordinary personality. The king was utterly besotted by her. He used to sort of make love to her at least twice a day. This is all recorded. And of course she was constantly pregnant, which also meant that she developed special kinds of dresses as well. Now the last idea that that I want to talk about in relation to her is this idea of glory. Now Louis XIV saw himself, he was, the kings at the time saw themselves as the kings by divine right. They weren't just people who'd arrived on the throne, they had a divine mission. On certain days of the year, the scroffer that used to line up in front of Notre Dame would be touched by the king. He had the power to heal and so on. But Louis XIV has even greater ideas than that. As you've seen, he sees himself as the sun god, as Hercules, and he needs a consort who is going to be as brilliant as him. And he was very worried about what he called his gloire, which translates as glory in English, but there's more in it in the French. It was supposed to be something which was all about his prestige, and encompassed everything that could magnify his power on earth at this time, that for posterity's sake as well. And he actually talks constantly about his gloire. He actually has his memoirs Ghost written for his son, in which he gives instructions. He constantly talks about gloire as being the obligation of a king. And when he's actually talking to the Académie Française, he sort of says, "You may judge, monsieur, the esteem that I have for you, because I am entrusting you the thing which is most precious to the world, my glory." Right? So it is, he is going to be patron of the greatest musicians, like Lully will compose works for him, Molière, Racine, and the other great painters. But he sees in Athénais an ornament to his glory, and Saint-Simon again says about Françoise, her mettle, her spirit, her beauty, which surpassed everything seen at the court, flattered the pride of the king, who showed her off like a treasure. He was proud of his mistress, and even when he was unfaithful to her, he returned quickly because she was more gratifying to his vanity. All right, so we then have an exceptional woman. He's a young man, and so his sort of sensuality is something which is paramount. However, he is going to evolve, as we'll see. So here we have Louis, very proud of his legs, by the way, as you can see. He's an older man at this stage. Now, he installed her as his mistress and would go off to war. This is how he'd go off to the Battle of Arras. All of the ladies of the court would come along, and here you would have poor old Maria Teresa sitting next to Athénais in the same carriage. And they would be there for a long time. You wonder what they spoke about, but possibly Athénais's wit would have overcome the stumbling French of the Infanta. Now, Louis XIV, when he wasn't actually sort of caressing his mistress or involved intensely in affairs of state, he was someone who knew every detail of everything, was very, very involved, not at all like Louis XV, who was not the slightest bit interested in worldly affairs of state. When he's not doing this, he's actually practicing his dancing. And it was important for him to appear in these ballets, which are going to be written by Lully and choreography for him. And here he dances in his high-heeled shoes as the god Apollo. And he's often going to appear with the Queen didn't dance, and so he would have one of his mistresses on one side and Louise LaBelle on the other, which is quite interesting. He develops Versailles, I'm going to actually have to go a bit quicker, in this idea of homage to himself as Apollo. His royal bedroom will be here, and all of this spins into perspective from the royal bedroom. When he gets up, the Sun King rises, everyone rises, and the sun is coming over the horizon. The fountains begin to play when he walks past them. Now, there wasn't any electricity or technology at the time. It was little gardeners in tunnels underneath. Someone blows a trumpet, he's coming, and the gardeners turn on the taps. As he walks past, they scuttle to the next fountain and turn on the taps. And it all looks absolutely magical. This is what Versailles was like. It was like a fairy kingdom. When they would have festivals or fêtes with music, the trees would be bedecked in sort of false flowers, ceramic flowers, in diamonds, in jewels, there'd be fireworks, and so on. I just quickly go through this sort of spectacular palace that he lived in, and there's one of the operas which was put on by Lully in the marble courtyard of the Louvre. Now, Athénais was someone, she was known by the others as Quanto, how much. She was constantly being given extraordinary gifts. You know, all the crown jewels again were at her behest, and he actually built for her this little love nest, which was a little trianon made out of porcelain. It was actually made out of Delft tiles, which had this huge bedroom with all mirrors around it, and you know, you had no, you know exactly what was going on there, sort of silver bed with golden tassels and so on. However, the trouble is that it actually started to disintegrate a little bit, and the king was going to build her the Trianon, the Grand Trianon. And again, Athénais thought it wasn't quite up to the stage. She said, this is the sort of thing you'd give a chorus girl. And so he then will give her an extraordinary estate, which is next to Versailles, and none of it exists. It was actually destroyed and then finally destroyed during the French Revolution. It was almost as big as Versailles. I think it cost something like $15 million of our dollars to build. It was built by Mansart, the greatest architect, and the gardens were by Lenôtre. And of course, they had to change constantly. The bulbs and everything had to, every time she walked through, she wanted to see something different. Orange trees, each of which cost a fortune, and so on. So this was the most expensive house which actually could be built, and it is his gift to her. Unfortunately, we don't have any idea of what it looked like, except this painting here, where she is seen lounging. You know, she never bothers sitting up, mainly because she's pregnant. She's wearing one of these loose outfits, but this was extraordinary sort of domed atrium that you would enter into. The Queen even came to have a look at it because she didn't have anything like it, did she? So, in the meantime, and this is unfortunate, I haven't left myself very much time for this very important woman, the Queen, at least Madame de Maintenon, now has a number of children. Here she's seen with two little ones who will die, I think of typhoid or scarlet fever, and these two will survive. This is the Duc du Maine. He's still in girls' clothing, and this is Mademoiselle de Nantes, who we'll see later. Now, being a royal mistress, they used to actually virtually give birth and then be back at the royal mass that evening, or actually dancing the next day. Louise LaBelle had to make out she wasn't really giving birth. The Queen walked through her apartments and heard her groaning and said, "What's the matter?" She said, "Oh, I've got a bit of colic." And basically they had to, you weren't given time out because you weren't the Queen. What do you do with all these children? So Athénais makes two big errors in judgment. She remembers a friend of hers who she has met at the salon of the Précieuses, and this is Madame, who will become Madame de Maintenon. And the king buys a property in Saint-Germain, a house, and the royal bastards buy Athénais are given over to Madame de Maintenon to bring up. And she is their governess. And she actually spends a lot of time personally with them and really feels that they are her own children. Now, she has none of her own, but they're given to her when, 3 or 4 days old. And right through to the end of her life, they will be much more attached to her than they are to her mother, who is, of course, too busy elsewhere. Now, the ones who are here, this is Mademoiselle de Nantes, and this is the Duc de Maine. These are 2 of them who will die. These are the children of Louis, just reasonably of interest because they will marry into the royal family. Sort of rather politically incorrect idea of the little black dwarf and the pug looking at each other. All right, so Mademoiselle de Nantes is the older one here, and this one here, who will marry into the royal family. There she is. 2 of the boys will become the Count of Toulouse and the Duc du Maine, who is the favourite son of Louis XIV, will also repudiate his mother. Now, Madame de Montespan also shared with Louis this love of food. Right. Louis actually, when he died, had an autopsy and they found that he had an enormous stomach. I think it was twice the size of most people. He used to eat enormous amounts of food, like a whole pheasant and a side of ham or something, at one sitting. And she used to eat as well. And eventually she became very heavy. She sort of had legs like tree stumps. And his eyes started to stray, and it strayed onto Marie-Angélique de Scoray, who was again absolutely beautiful. The family realised she was incredibly good looking, looked like the official mistress, so they sent her to court, and she actually becomes pregnant but dies a little bit after having delivered a stillborn child, which was probably something to do with the placenta. However, at the time there was a witch hunt on. A new prefect of police had been appointed by Louis XIV, who was investigating sorcery and witches in Paris. And he came across a woman, La Voisin, who was convicted of being a witch. She started out, and who testified under torture, mind you, that Madame de Montespan had been her client for a long time. She had first of all started out asking for elixirs to make the king love her, then aphrodisiacs to make the king, more potent, and then finally she had asked for a poison to kill the king, and even worse than that, had taken part in the Black Mass where she'd lain naked on the altar and had the blood of unborn children sprinkled on her. And La Voisin, witches also were abortionists at the same time, which was a mortal sin. This, of course, has now been proved to be totally incorrect, but there were, when people died at court, there was always the thought, had they been poisoned? And so when Madame de Scoray dies, Louis refuses to have an autopsy done on her because he's actually afraid that they might find poison. So Madame de Montespan's star basically is waning, and it is waning because, what am I doing in the wrong way? Because of this, there is a series on at the moment called Versailles. I don't know if any of you are watching it yet. And this is the woman that cast as Madame de Montespan, and I can't understand why. I really cannot understand why she doesn't look the slightest bit in character, or she doesn't act in character either. Anyway, we have Madame de Maintenon. There are 2 mistakes, as I said, that Françoise did. She brought Madame de Maintenon in as the royal governess, and also she brought in a firebrand preacher into the court. And this preacher, Bossuet, will be so convincing that the king begins to worry about the fact that he has been in an adulterous affair with a woman who was also married, because Madame de Montespan also had a husband at the time. So double adultery, does that mean double time in hell? So as he's getting older, he's starting to worry about his eternal gloire and not just the sort of pleasures of the flesh. He gets to know Madame Scarron, who starts out her life as Françoise d'Aubigny, the daughter of a very, very vaguely aristocratic family, the daughter of François d'Aubigny, who is a Protestant or Huguenot poet. She's actually born in prison when her father is in prison because he's been a Huguenot, and basically has her only claim to any sort of rise in social rank would be that for some reason one of her godmothers was a Catholic, Madame de Rochefort, right? Who owned some of the convents, and they were horrified to think that their godchild was being brought up as a Protestant, and so they put her in a convent and then give her enough money to go to Paris with a relative. While she's in Paris, she is going to be in straitened circumstances. What did you do if you had no money for a dowry? If you were educated, you became a governess. Or you go into a convent. And she meets a poet, Paul Scarron, who is a satirical poet who is 25 or 26 years older than her, who is totally contorted by either, we think, polio now, or maybe some kind of rheumatoid arthritis, but his head was sort of on one side and his body was on the other, like a Z, and he was in a wheelchair and so on. And he actually says to her, he enjoys her conversation, sees that she's intelligent and steady and very pious, and this is the important point. He says, look, I'll give you a dowry to enter a convent, because to enter a convent you had to pay a dowry to the church, or you can marry me. And she decides she'll marry him instead, which means that she really finds sort of sexual relations and things rather ghastly. And this will continue on in her relation with Louis XIV. So they're going to have a completely reversed kind of relationship from the one he had with Madame de Montespan. But it is through him that she will then enter those salons, this brilliant literary circle, and will meet Madame de Maintenon, who is impressed by the stability, the sensible nature of this young woman who hasn't got enough money and is going to eventually have to go off with the Queen of Portugal in her as a lady of waiting and a lower level of the household. And so she proposes that she become the royal governess. And so this is where she meets Louis XIV, who really doesn't like her very much at all. He finds her pious, but he enjoys her conversation, and he's very impressed by the bond that she has established with his children. All right? So he's someone who's come from a very close bond with his mother, who is also intelligent, stable, and pious. Whereas his royal mistress at the moment is sort of sensual, tempestuous, and really rather getting in the way, and is not helping his eternal soul. So he will establish a relationship with her, and eventually the star of Madame de Montespan fades, and she doesn't go into a convent as royal mistresses are supposed to. She goes and lives at Clagny, and then spends the rest of her life doing good works to try and save her eternal soul, because we're now at the time of the Jesuits, of course, of the Counter-Reformation, with this idea that the difference between Protestants and Catholics were, if you're a Catholic, you could gain, entry to heaven by good works. And so she sets up orphanages and throws herself into it with the same sort of gusto as she threw into sort of her life with Louis XIV. She's quite an interesting character. Meanwhile, you get this very calculating woman who now enters the court and gradually becomes more and more powerful. And at one stage, Madame de Montespan says, when he's having the affair with that woman who died, there's three of us in this court, a bit like Princess Diane and that. Yes, I have the title, she has the king's bed, but you have his soul. And once, of course, they got rid of the rival, they started their fighting again. However, Madame de Montespan realised that she has lost, and she's also lost her children, because the children who remain are much more faithful and affectionate to Madame de Montespan. Eventually, Madame de Montespan, she'll be given the chateau. She is no longer the widow Scarron. She becomes Madame. She becomes a marquise with her own castle. And when Anne of Austria dies, several months later, the king marries her in secret. Now, this is called a morganatic marriage. In other words, it's one which is never acknowledged, and there are no documents that support this, but no one is in any doubt that this did not happen, right? And Madame de Montespan writes about it. The court knew about it, but there's no document in the archives that you can see. However, the behaviour of the king was clear that she was his wife. She was brought up to live in a suite of rooms opposite the king, up on his level, and she is allowed to wear ermine as well. She will never boast about it, although it must have been rather sort of galling, because it was a misalliance, right? She was someone who didn't have any rank. But it got the king out of the situation. He now had a woman who was going to save his soul, and he wasn't doing it out of adultery, it was his wife. But she actually writes, there are letters that she's written to her confessor sort of saying that, you know, she has to submit to him, and sort of she closes her eyes and thinks of heaven virtually, and it is better to do these things for the sake of the king's soul, and so on. So she sees herself as a martyr to the cause. And will be there finally when he finally dies. Now, Madame de Montespan will have died before this, and the king will not allow her children to wear mourning for her, right? And it is Madame de Maintenon who will get the lands for this little Duc du Maine for all of those bastard children whom she sees as her own, and they will constantly consider her as their mother. So it's again a sort of triumph, I suppose, of the mistress. But it is very interesting the way in which he reverts to a woman who was very much like his mother. So just a couple of minutes. She also turns to good works and sets up a girls' school for aristocrats, children who've fallen on a hard time, and sets up a school where young, aristocratic women are taught languages, literature, astronomy, geography, and all of those sorts of things. And she is the patron. Her portrait is there. And Racine even writes a special play which is put on by these students at Saint-Cyr. So she and Madame de Montespan are both struggling with good works for their soul. So I suppose I want to conclude with this idea of this sort of rivalry between the sort of mistresses, the maîtresse en titre, who's finally outdone by someone whom he marries, the rivalry between the Queen and Madame de Diane de Poitiers, who also has the same role, you will have noticed, as governess of the children as well. But this sort of triangle or thing that we had here between the woman who was, in many ways, this sort of the Queen, or the role, the maîtresse en titre, who is finally unseated, and the final youngest person, who François Hollande, in the latest sort of thing that I read about a couple of weeks ago, is actually thinking of marrying. So I think the way in which we should end this is plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. As Beckett said, more it changes, nothing has changed. All right, thank you very much.